Thanks very much, Ella. Hello, everyone. I'm Victoria Hudson. I'm a lecturer in Defence Studies at King's College London, based in Shrivenham at the UK Defence Academy. But I'm also the co-convener of the Visa Working Group on East European and Eurasian Security. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to our webinar today on this somewhat less covered aspect of the Russia-Ukraine war, that of paganism. Um, it's surely been an empowering factor in cultural revival in Russia and Ukraine, but equally, as is becoming somewhat clear, in some instances, it's also playing a role in mobilizing extremist elements and shaping narratives seeking to justify violence and extremist acts. So we have three great speakers today. Taras Tarasiuk, unfortunately, is unable to join us, and it's a real pity because not only is he a research analyst based in Kiev, but he also is a serving member of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So on the front line, not only metaphorically, but also literally. Um, Still, I will share a list of further reading later on in the webinar, so you will be able to get an insight into his analysis from that. In the meantime, we are fortunate enough to be joined by three excellent speakers. Today we have Adrian Nonjon, Kaarina Aitamurto, and Denis Brylov. I'll be introducing each of those individually before they start to speak. And there should be indeed time for questions afterwards. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to Ross Downing. He's a researcher affiliated with the Inform charity, which supports research into minority religions. And Ross has been the driving force behind our research network into paganism. He'll say a few words about that and provide an overarching introduction to the theme. Thanks very much, Ross. Over to you.
Thanks, Victoria. Okay, let's try and share this PowerPoint. Okay. Hopefully we're on. Right. So my name is Ross Downing, as Victoria said. My background is in religious and political ideologies. I'm a research associate of the UK educational organisation called Inform, who asked me to produce this book, which came out on Bloomsbury Academic Press in January 2025. And I co-edited the book with one of our guests, Dr. Kaarina Aitamurto, who is one of the world's leading experts on Slavic paganism. It also features contributions from Dr. Victoria Hudson, Dr. Adrian Nonjon, and Taras Tarasiuk, who are among our other guests today. So the book and this webinar is an extension of the group that Dr. Victoria Hudson and I are part of. We go by the loose name of the Pagan Extremism Research Network. We are UK-based and we include key members from the UK Police, UK Ministry of Justice, private sector counter-extremism, etc. So what do we mean by pagan extremism? Basically, our network is in consensus that what most people diagnose as neo-Nazis could, in some cases, be seen not as political, but as religious. Many far-right extremists have Christian and/or pagan religious beliefs, and our team often compares this with Islamic extremists who can have strong nationalist and political interests, but are often categorized by their religious worldviews rather than by their politics. So one key example of someone we could convincingly argue as a famous pagan extremist would be Anders Breivik, and you can see a picture relating to him there. So our framework focuses on paganism rather than Nazism due to a point of view from a prevention of prevention and countering extremism point of view. So it gives us more tools, but in some cases it potentially gives us better tools. Specifically allows us to better identify extremists using the language and imagery they use or often use to employ plausible deniability or to creep under the censorship radar. It allows us to de-radicalize using the language they communicate their worldviews in, and it allows us to offer new socially positive paths forward using their religion rather than trying to remove their religion from them. Again, this is structurally a similar approach to basic de-radicalization processes when working with Islamic extremism. One of the first scholars to identify the issue of pagan extremism, although he didn't use the term, was Matthias Gardell talking to the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2001. And he said the racist position has grown tremendously fast in the last 4 or 5 years. The militant racists today probably make up between 40 and 50% of, as a true being, Germanic paganism or Norse paganism. And he said more than half of young people coming into the racist right are now pagans. Young people are not being drawn in by Christian identity. Racist paganism is the most important radical religion today. And he flagged that situation 25 years ago. But back in 2001, we were obviously focused on jihad. Another interesting bit of research was conducted by the Pew Research Center in 2012, and they issued a report based on surveys and interviews with terrorists in US prisons about their religious affiliations, and they estimated that 39% were pagans. So when we use the word pagan in this webinar, we are generally only referring to Slavic paganism. So it's important to point out that there are many different kinds of paganism. Paganism is not a specific religion in itself. So you have Norse paganism, Celtic paganism, etc. And these are very separate religious communities and religions. So we shouldn't think of paganism as a single idea or a single religion or a single community. And the two major pagan religions that our research network sees as a security issue are Germanic paganism, which is often called Asatru, heathenry, or even Odinism, and then Slavic paganism, which is often referred to by its Russian name Rodnoveri. Now, Germanic paganism is based on Norse mythology and runes, and the reason I'm mentioning it here briefly is that it's probably the pagan religion that you are most familiar with as existing among neo-Nazis. And Germanic paganism is also the largest pagan religion in the West. And to be clear, again, the majority of Norse pagans are not extremists. In fact, most are anti-racist. Now, our second identified threat, and what this webinar is all about, is Slavic paganism. This mainly exists in Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland, and to a lesser extent in Central Europe and perhaps even the Balkans. It has no significant numbers of followers in the West, and Slavic paganism does borrow a great deal or a significant set of attributes from Norse paganism or modern Norse paganism. So there is some overlap there. But perhaps more importantly, there are lines of communication between Slavic pagan extremists in Ukraine and Russia with Norse pagan extremists in Europe. As we've outlined in our book, which I mentioned at the beginning, when we talk of pagans, we are perhaps best imagining people to be sympathetic to, interested in, and inspired by, or simply just identifying sometimes as pagan. There are many, many more people who seem to sympathize and identify with paganism than actually attend regular rituals and pay membership fees to pagan organizations. But to be fair, this is a fairly similar situation to what we see with other religions such as Christianity. Not all people who identify as Christians go to church every Sunday. So, what is unique now with Slavic paganism is that we have this pagan extremism present in both Ukrainian and Russian military units. But clearly, not all pagan soldiers are extremists, and this raises a lot of nuanced questions. And obviously, to explore those questions, we have our fantastic guests. But before I let them speak, I'll explain briefly what Slavic paganism is. So, the word that is often used in the English language generally comes from the Russian word rodnovery, which means native faith, and there are cognates of this in Ukrainian and Polish, well, they're in all the Slavic languages. Again, it's important to say that most Slavic pagans are not racist. But to give some kind of context to what, if we could summarize what the religion is about, it focuses on ideas about or takes inspiration from the religion that is imagined to have existed before Christianity, but also the folklore and folk beliefs of recent centuries. Primarily, the idea is of a relationship with one's ancestors and the sanctity of nature. This idea of ancestry and nature can easily become a belief in ethnicity and claims of ownership of a specific territory. To put it more bluntly, it can become a belief in race and nation, with the gods of nature being both of someone's blood and in the soil of their country. It's a very powerful and simple idea, and it often appears logical, and it can appeal strongly to basic emotions. It can also be quite motivating to a person who seeks morale and inspiration to fight, not least in what they see as a defense of their blood, soil, nation, ethnicity, or their gods. So most scholars agree that the modern religion in Eastern Europe was first established in Poland and Ukraine in the 1920s and 30s, and it was influenced primarily by German Völkisch romantic nationalism, but it adapted to the idea of Polish or Ukrainian nationhood. Its Polish form was significantly influenced by Julius Evola, who's a writer I recommend everyone look up if they don't already know of him, whilst its Ukrainian form was strongly influenced by ideas about the Hindu Vedas. During the Soviet period, the religion was mainly dormant or limited to very small circles of intellectuals and artists, but it emerged in significant numbers immediately after the fall of the Soviet Union, which does indicate that there were ongoing interests among the general public during the Soviet period. Before I conclude, I just thought I'd give you a second or two to scan some of these headlines. Obviously, some of this is sensationalist, it's propaganda, etc., but it will give you some idea of what we'll be talking about today. And naturally, if anyone watching would like more information on our research and activities, you're welcome to contact myself or Dr. Victoria Hudson directly. So to summarize, the emergence of the internet has been important to the growth of the religion. The internet has also allowed Russian sources to have greater influence on social media and publicizing digital resources on Slavic paganism. Slavic paganism continues to be a key ingredient in folk culture, and specifically in Ukraine and Russia, it appears to be very popular among military personnel. And this is where I'll allow our guests to take over and tell us more. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Ross, for that really useful introduction to our theme today. I will now indeed hand the mic to Adrian Nonjon. Adrian is a researcher and PhD candidate in history at the Centre for Research of Eurasia and Europe of the Paris National Institute of Oriental Languages and Civilizations. His fields of study includes imaginaries and geographical doctrines, radical political movements, and currents or cultures and countercultures. Thanks, Adrian. The mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Just for a small precision, I'm not at INALCO anymore, and now based in Paris Catholic Institute. So first of all, I will share my screen, hoping that all is working for now. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Continue de partager. Okay. So, thank you very much. So, as we said before, in many respects, Ukrainian neo-Paganism remains a poorly understood subject, but yet Russia's invasion of Ukraine has given it a renewed importance and considerably greater visibility. So this conflict indeed has profoundly reshaped the spiritual, identity-based, and political stakes at play. And in the context of national survival, the invocation of ancient Slavic deities and pre-Christian beliefs is no longer merely a matter of religious conviction. It has come actually above all a symbolic resource. So since my colleague will be addressing in greater details the current dynamics of Slavic neo-Paganism in both Russia and Ukraine, I will confine my remarks to a historical overview of Ukrainian Ridna Vera, from its supposed origins through its tentative of re-emergence during the interwar period to the contemporary revival in the beginning of the 90s. So this is in fact, we'll see together a long turbulent history. But beyond this panorama, I will also briefly outline some core beliefs upon which Ukrainian neo-paganism rests. So, complementing Ross' remarks, I will also bring some few definitional remarks as well. So, actually, yes, with a rare exception, neo-paganism constitutes a reinvented religious tradition based on a range of different influences from anthropology and its fascination for indigenous people and the so-called primitive cultures, and as well as history, archaeology, and we will see also literature. Neo-paganism often maintains close ties with esotericism and occultism, understood here as hidden knowledge accessible only through initiation, and the concept of a spiritual transmission plays a central role as the practitioners claimed a form of continuity with the past. Also, there is an important distinction to make between neo-paganism and what we can call a New Age. A New Age actually is a spirituality, a new universal one in nature, blending multiple religious and pseudo-scientific traditions. But on the contrary, neo-paganism, by contrast, celebrates a specific ethno-national tradition of origin. And of course, for the terminology itself, so in Ukrainian we say Ridna Vera most commonly. Ridna means indigenous, ancestral, or kinship, and Vera means faith or religion. So the compound terms Ridna Vera was coined the first time in 1964 by one of the first neo-pagan ideologue, Lev Silenko, and I will talk a bit about him later. So let's start with the historical background. So yes, Ridna Vera itself situates itself within the long tradition of Slavic religions. Well, actually, we don't know so much about what was really the religion of the Slavic tribes that formed after the Kievan rules. Of course, we have some testimonies, but these testimonies were written by monks, which were sent to Eastern Europe to Christianize its people, and of course they wrote their testimonies with a kind of a BA telling that of course paganism is the religion of a savage people compared to Christianity, which is splendid and for civilization. So we can see here the most important dichotomy between yes Christianism, civilization, and paganism, which is the religion of the peasant, of the nature, which has nothing to do with the so-called civilization at the time. So Of course, everything changed after the baptism of the Kievan Rus and its prince Volodymyr in 888. But we can, despite the disappearance of the official cults in Kievan Rus, you have several scholars that actually found, and I can quote here, for example, Linda Ivanitz or even Maria Lesiv, that noted that in practices and myth, paganism survived by being absorbed into rural folklore like songs, superstitions, seasonal customs, and in fact, it creates a kind of a duality faith. So in Ukraine, Christianity functioned less as a replacement but as one more layer added to existing tradition. During the 19th century, you had more important interest in the whole faith, and it emerged during this time. Alongside the broader current of Slavic Romanticism and Pan-Slavism, Imperial Ukraine experienced a national awakening. So, inspired by different artists, writers such as Taras Shevchenko, you have intellectual that turn their attention to rural cultures and their origins. And the most striking example here is Lesia Ukrainka, who is a very famous Ukrainian poetess that wrote the Song of the Forest, Lisova Pisnya, a work scattered with references to mythological figures such as the Dryad or Magvaz, and more than a simple return to roots, Ukrainka waves the pagan archetypes and founding myth together, creating a kind of a symbolic space between memory and modernity. During the 20th century, you had the rise of the Indo-European linguistic and, of course, the colonial encounter with Asia, which prompted new questions about European origins, and it provided actually Ukrainian neo-Paganism its first intellectual framework and as well a nationalist inflection. So the first one was actually the Sanskrit Volodymyr Shayan, who in 1934 founded the newspaper Dashbo in Lviv, alongside a very important figure of in linguistic and folklore studies. And actually, he advocated the reviving of Ukrainian indigenous Slavic faith because Shayan saw a return to the ancient pantheon as both a remedy for a Christian dominance and a romantic utopia capable of overturning the established modern order. Of course, like Ross said, well, you had still this influence of folkish ideas. So did Volodymyr Shayan with this Aryan ideas circulating in nationalist and raciological circles during the interwar years. But Shayan actually sought to distance himself from the dominant interpretation emanating from German National Socialism, dealing more with the so-called Aryan state of mind elaborated by Julius Evola. So during the Second World War, Shayan founded the Order of the Knights of the Sun God, which was a kind of a paramilitary organization within the Ukrainian nationalist organization. But after the war, he fled to Germany and then to England to establish the Orden Publishing House before emigrating to North America. And together with his disciple, Lev Silenko, they tried to reviving in the diaspora an Ukrainian faith. But unfortunately, well, Volodymyr Shayan, who was very close to Lev Silenko, split with him during the mid-60s because they didn't have the same interpretation of what should be the true Ukrainian native faith. Of course, during the Soviet era, you had, of course, a kind of rebirth, let's say like that, encouraged by the Soviet authorities because Stalin, at the very end of his rule, wanted to demonstrate that ancient communism and the Russian people were the mothers. Of USSR, and he encouraged actually many scholars like Boris Rybakov, who was the archaeologist who established the first research and first scientific argument, which were borrowed by actual neo-pagan doctriners. And of course, during the 70s, 60s and the 70s, during Khrushchev and even Brezhnev era, well, you had a kind of interest from the Soviet authorities for a paganism because, well, it was a kind of expression of rural folklore and Marxism, Leninism. Then we arrived into the post-Soviet revival. So during the 90s, you have a larger revival, which is due to one person in particular, Halina Sergeyevna Losko, who is also known by a ritual title, Volhyvnia Zoreslava, so High Priestess Zoreslava. She's trained as a folklorist, and she was a founder, one key member of the first group, Ukrainian pagan group during the perestroika, Pravoslava. She rediscovered actually Volodymyr Shayan's work, and this helped her to shape a new approach of paganism, bringing it both academic rigor and ideological ambition. So she established contact with Volodymyr Shayan community in Hamilton, Canada, and she did access to different key work of Shayan, and she received in exchange a recognition from the Hamilton community, leading her to have a pagan baptism in 1994, becoming Magi Zoreslava. So she became actually the head leader of the Ukrainian neo-paganism with the founding of one important organization in 1988, which is the All Ukrainian Council of Native Faith, or ORU, if we can if you prefer, which is approximately according also by the work of from the work of Maria Lessive, about 10,000 adherents or even sympathizers. So she did a lot, actually giving more important work, different treaties, and also she tried to expand neo-paganism recognition among Ukrainian society, but also outside of Ukraine. Actually, she developed her activities within the World Congress of Ethnic Religion, and also she played an important role in funding a broader transnational pagan movement with her former husband, Pavel Tulayev, who is one new right theorist. So this association was the Rodovi Sloviansky Vishe, to create dialogue between different neo-pagan cultures and movements. So here you have a different work from Halina Losko. First of all, is Ukrainskie Narodnazwo, which is her based on her PhD dissertation, and also and most important, the journal Zvaro, who was actually printed for the first time in 1995, and which concentrate all the most important writings from Losko and Oru movement. So regarding the beliefs, well, I said that you have, of course, different pagan communities, but the two most important are Oru and Runvira. So Oru is based on the Volodymyr Shayan works and embraces polytheism, and also embrace Alina Losko ideas, drawing on the book of Veles, which is a manuscript whose authenticity remains deeply contested, and try to tell the story of Slavic people since all the times. And contrary to Oru, Runvira is a kind of a monotheism centered on only one book called the Mahavira, published in 1979. So, well, very quickly, the different beliefs that we can see in Rinavira is, of course, the myth of Aryan origins. For neo-pagans, actually, Ukraine represents one of the last bastion of Aryan civilization, heir to a Vedic wisdom set against the Western decadence and foreign influence, Christianity chief among them. So you have a record of the Aryan myth based on the Indo-European theories, and also the link with nature, which is, according to Alina Losko, based on the legacy of the Tripilia culture, which was a very ancient people at the very beginning of a Neolithic era. And also, for sure, you have, of course, the dedication to natural rhythm. You have a very an important cosmology regarding nature, and of course, you have sometimes, right-wing elements. So, for example, we can see that in Losco. Losco actually draws different references like Nietzsche, the neo-rightist, French neo-rightist Guillaume Fay, archaeofuturism, and also sometimes radical traditionalism like René Guénon and Julius Evola. And actually, Elina Losco was really close to the French neo-right from the 90s to 2000s, and also the white nationalist circle. So for sure, she developed a kind of ethno-nationalist which reject the mixing of people, and of course you can find anti-Semitism in some aspect of her thinking, because actually because of the importance of nature, they think that Christianism, which is a heir of Judaism, is a religion from the desert. So Christians don't have any link to nature. Here actually I can pass, but I can show it later. One important quote from Losco making the parallel between the paganism and the Aryan worldviews, and I go strict on the contemporary era. Yes, for sure. So since the beginning of war, we can see that many people developed a fascination or an attraction to paganism. So it doesn't mean at all that they do believe into paganism, but sometimes they think that paganism corresponds to a kind of a warrior ethos against Russia. So you have a different variant, but as Ross said, actually you have now a kind of hybridation between Slavic paganism and German Nordic paganism. And the most important example, of course, maybe most of you have seen this scenes before, is inside the Azov Corp, which is very influenced by this hybridation. And one important event reflecting that is, of course, the Day of the Death, then Mjordvir, which celebrate at each autumn equinox since 2015 the death of the units, and it borrows a lot from the Nordic, so-called Nordic folklore, like the Drakkar burning, the term Vri, which is the kind of Valhalla, and so you can see an hybridation right now regarding the war, the necessity to find new identities to distinguish themselves from Russian Orthodoxy, etc. And also in the far-right interpretation, like saying that we defend true Europe against Russia, that should be more Asian than European. Well, I will stop here, but if you have any question about my presentation, I will be very happy to answer and to develop more aspect of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for that fascinating perspective on the emergence of Ukrainian neo-paganism. We will then move on to our next speaker, Kaarina Aitamurto. Kaarina is a docent of the study of religion and a senior researcher at the Alexandria Institute of the University of Helsinki. Her research interests focus on the nexus of religion and nationalism in Russia, contemporary Slavic paganism and Islam. Thank you. Over to you, Kaarina.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this fascinating event. Let me see. I first try to share my slides. In this presentation, I will focus on selective securitization of Slavic paganism, especially in Russia. And I think that this is quite an important topic in several ways. First of all, as you mentioned, my other topic of interest or study is Islam, and I have noticed that especially before 2022, propagandist narratives about religious extremism was used very often by Russia, labeling many Islamic groups and actors, political dissenters, as extremists, and quite often these were bought or accepted in the West. And of course, Russia targets not only Western audiences, but also other parts of the world, claiming that Russian Orthodoxy is threatened by these horrible Ukrainian pagans. And I think it's easy to exaggerate these kind of phenomena like contemporary paganism because it's something new and exciting, and it's easy to create some kind of moral panic. And one thing why I think that we should be very careful when we look at these exaggerating sensational narratives is that indeed we are also talking about marginal religion, so there are also several different kind of ethical questions involved. But here are some pieces from Russian media where it's very typical to claim that pagans form a significant or major or important part in not only in Ukrainian army but also Ukrainian politics. So the revolution of dignity they were pagans, mostly pagans, so they have a major role there and so on. Exaggerating the role of pagans. The second one is that they are kind of blurring the meaning of what is pagan. So in one of these, the Komsomolskaya Pravda, which is actually quite a major newspaper, argues that Ukraine is creating some kind of new religion, Banderivist paganism, which is of course quite virtual, and there some kind of invention. There is actually an Orthodox priest there blessing some soldiers. The claim probably is that Ukrainian nationalism is inherently pagan. And this is quite typical when we look at these Russian narratives about paganism in Ukraine. The term is used, or the word is used often quite vaguely. One very actually high-level authority actually even mentioned as a part of these horrible Ukrainian neo-pagan groups a Jewish Chabad Lubavitch, which is of course very established, important, actually the most significant, perhaps in some ways politically Jewish organization in Russia, and then the authority was removed from his post. But anyway, it's a good example of how widely this word paganism is often used in Russian media. And what is a little bit surprising is that it seems that this narrative about extremist, radical, cultist Ukrainian pagans is bought also by many Russian pagans, because I have encountered a couple of times that even though Russian pagans have very similar rituals, shrines, as they draw the same sources and so on, Russian pagans claim that these Ukrainian pagans are something like a subculture or something like that. But so one of the main reasons why Russia justifies its attack on Ukraine is that it's denazifying Ukraine. But of course, it's easy to point out that actually in the Russian army there are many Nazis that's openly claim to be Nazis. Also, many people who may not claim to be Nazi, but nevertheless have very or somewhat similar ideology and so on. This is a picture and a quote from Alexei Milchakov, who is one of the co-founder and co-leader of the infamous Russo-Ukraine group in Russian army. But now, of course, it should be said that not all of the pagans who are fighting in the on Russian side are as radical as these Rusic guys, and a fascinating studies of a Russian scholar of religion, Roman Shizensky, give a picture of the very different kind of motives and worldviews and ideologies of these pagans fighting in the front on Russian side. Moreover, not though several scholars are in opinion that the majority of Russian pagans do support the war, not all of them do so. For example, perhaps one of the main leaders of Russian contemporary Radnaverie recently stated in social media discussions that his estimation is that about 70% of pagans or Radnaveres supported the invasion of Ukraine. Though it should be noted that, of course, that doesn't mean that these who oppose the war do not hold some kind of ultranationalist or far-right opinions. But I'm not going deeper into the history of Russian paganism, Slavic paganism, or Radnaverie, or even to the current racist, anti-Semitic, or far-right, ultranationalist currents in the movements. I think it's enough to say that it has been a problem in the movement since the very beginning of it in Soviet times, and there has been quite a few different kind of radical movements involved or being part of it since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it has also been a constant topic of discussions. Perhaps not that's central as Scandinavian paganism in the West, but anyway, there has been some debates and disputes and so on. At the beginning of 2000s, the authorities started to check a little bit this radicalism and racist violence because indeed the situation was so horrible. I mean, racist murders were quite common in Russia and so on. But at the same time, it was connected to the general authoritarianization process. And several scholars argue that even though it's very difficult to get kind of concrete proofs that the political elites have been and are using, of course, there are different kind of political elites, so I'm not talking about Kremlin or Putin personally, but they are using these nationalist groups when they are useful for them, but they can also turn against them if necessary, if it comes politically advantage, or if they are not needed anymore. And with paganism, we see perhaps some kind of evidence of this kind of development. The conservative turn at the beginning of 2010 that was caused by the massive protest, or the starting point was the massive protests against rigged elections and so on. And after that, Putin's rhetoric turned much more conservative. Conservative values became more central in the political rhetoric, and also different kind of policies. And one important change was the growing role of the Russian Orthodox Church, and it gained almost kind of dominant hegemonic position in religion, but also much more to say in society in general, in cultural matters, in different sectors of life. And at the same time, one can say that also the control of paganism became stricter, because so far even though there has been perhaps during the 2000s, several pagan groups were banned, much literature were banned as radical or extremism. It was indeed only the 2010s when, as Ross mentioned, Kirill has repeatedly expressed his concerns about pagans in Russian army, police, militia, and so on. And indeed, several Russian pagans that I have been discussing earlier have said that when the police or security services are visiting their rituals, or they usually silently express some kind of sympathy. So the repression was really not similar as many Western newer religions. But so the position of paganism has become weaker or more vulnerable. And for example, if we look at some media in 2000s, there were many positive featuring of pagan rituals and so on. But in 2010s, it's more often presented as a kind of social problem. So has this checking of radical forms of paganism been effective? First of all, I would say that there is indeed some kind of depoliticization of many pagan communities. And it's actually quite intriguing that when I look at the social media channels or web pages of many pagan communities that previously seemed to be quite engaged in political or societal matters, now it's very strictly about tradition, about ancient gods, rituals, folklore, and so on, not so much about politics. But here, of course, we have to remember the methodological challenges when we are studying Russian Slavic paganism. Outside of Russia, so I don't have any access to rituals or gatherings of Slavic pagans in Russia. It's very difficult to discuss, even ask people, because voicing their opinion openly might cause some troubles for them. So in some sense, we may have to wait until we have more opportunities to actually do some fieldwork. It's quite possible that in these rituals and gatherings where people who don't voice any kind of radical opinions on the internet or even in social media may talk differently in their meetings. But the repression or the increasing attention of security services has really caused some concerns within these Slavic pagans. And there are some pagans themselves and also experts who are quite kind of realistically or just mention casually that one scenario for the movement is that it will be seriously repressed. And then, of course, the question is that will it go underground or something like that? But curiously, that when the authorities target different kind of groups, it has always been selective. And I occasionally wonder whether the fact that some authors or some groups have been saved or not been targeted is because they have some connections with some elites or other authorities. The growing role of the Orthodox Church really has impact. This year, earlier in the spring, a festival, Maslenitsa Shrovetide, that has been organized near Moscow in a forest since the late Soviet times. And it's a massive gathering, something like thousands of people going there for a couple of days. It was cancelled, and it then, when there were some people who refused to or anyway went to the site, the police went to clear the area, and revealing there were a radical Orthodox group, some members of the radical Orthodox group, Sarakov, also participating in this raid. But what is curious is indeed that this is very kind of innocent, folkloric, massive events that usually gathers much participants, and it has even been featured beyond Russia as an interesting event, and it doesn't have any clear links to paganism as a religious movement. but it tells that this pressure from the Orthodox Church really has impact on policies in Russia. But then there are new Orthodox far-right groups enjoying some support from the security services and the police. Perhaps one of the most prominent one is the Russian community that actually works occasionally in tandem with police. They target Central Asian migrants, different kind of minorities, LGBTQI communities, and so on. And they are quite violent, but they have not received or they don't seem to face any kind of punishment for their activity. So definitely they have some kind of very strong political support. But then a couple of weeks ago, I actually read an article where the journalist interviewed Dmitry Gromov from Russian Academy of Science. And it was actually quite balanced article, but and he mentioned that there were two periods of radicalism in Russian Radnavirye, but claimed that now there is practically no far-right wing in paganism. And two alternatives came into my mind. So one is that perhaps the person does not want to see these radical currents or don't want to count these as radical. And the other one is that perhaps actually from Russian perspective, what we outside of Russia, especially in Western countries, see as kind of radicalism and worrisome phenomena is not that in Russia. And the next quote is coming from, it was originally posted in a Telegram channel of I don't name this community, but it's a kind of Northern Slavic community that it curiously includes both Orthodox Christian and pagan people who have, many of them have been in the war, and they conduct military patriotic work with children and so on. And when you read it, this text it's actually quite kind of extreme. So it paints this kind of dichotomy of our enemies and eternal fight that is existential. So if Russia falls, these enemies, that is Ukrainian and Westerners, they will slaughter everyone and so on. So this kind of creating enemy images is seen as a kind of not extreme, not radical, but patriotic activity. And this posting was shared in the Telegram channel of one pagan community that in its channels claims that we don't accept any political discussions or justification of Hitlerism or Nazism. But this was kind of okay. So this is the kind of mainstream at the moment in Russia, it seems. But then there is even more, perhaps, these enemy images. This is another poster or posting that was shared. It's an old Soviet time poster about spies and terrorists. And the terrorist here is apparently a Ukrainian. This is Mikola, and he has a Ukrainian flag. The poster basically says that don't spend your sympathies with him because he's probably a terrorist. And what I found intriguing here is that if you look at the figure, it shares some features what is in these propaganda posters kind of attached to these anti-Semitic pictures. So actually, though it's not always quite always these anti-Semitic tropes and images and hints can also be found in Russian ultranationalist, but also what could be considered as patriotic rhetoric. And then coming from Russian Telegram channel, these Ku Klux Klan hoods, where they were joking that perhaps we should adopt these as the official uniform of African Corps, and it reflects or reveals very well about the kind of racism that is so prevalent in not only in Rusic, but in many channels, perhaps not so blatant as here. And I'm not even going to talk about Central Asian migrants, all these racist tropes. And actually, in many these channels that are close or partly pagan, there are also very often different kind of stereotypes about Russian minorities, even the kind of very accepted old minorities like Bashkirs or Tatars, when they talk about their rights. So this is kind of seen as threatening the majority of Russians. Let's move on to the conclusions. So the securitization of Slavic paganism, when you look at the Russian discussions, it somehow often seems quite perplexing in many ways, because it seems to target many innocent organizations, events, actors, and so on, but at the same time leave out the most, occasionally, the most violent or threatening or racist or ultranationalist or Nazi forms. And then I think when I look at these Russian pagan groups, it reminds me of the kind of dilemma that I see, and I think that many of my colleagues share about Russian future. So many of these radical pagans, or even less radical pagans, they might be critical of the current regime. So they criticize the censorship, the arbitrary persecution of critics, what the jurisdictional system is doing at the moment, how it functions. They criticize corruption and the extreme conservative morality that the Russian Orthodox Church is advocating. But the alternative that they offer is not necessarily a better one. So obviously, I'm not saying that all of the pagan critics of Russian current regime share these features of racism, Islamophobia, ultranationalism, or demonization of Ukraine, or selective anti-Westernism or anti-democracy, but many of them do. So the racism and the kind of very violent or aggressive kind of nationalism is very, very common, even in those parts of pagans who may occasionally criticize Putin, or even advocate some kind of more democratic rule. And another, what I found very worrisome phenomenon is also the fact that these Russian propaganda narratives about Ukraine and the West, again, kind of selectively the liberal West, not all Westerners, but demonization of Ukrainians. It seems that a large part of contemporary Russian pagans, again, it's just my kind of feeling, because it's impossible to get any reliable information, that seems to have adopted and accepted that kind of demonization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kaarina, for this fascinating and nuanced account here. We will then move on to our final speaker, Denis Brylov, who is a psychologist and anthropologist of religion and head of Modern Studies Department at the A. Krimsky Institute of Oriental Studies of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine in Kiev, and also an associated researcher at the Leibniz Center for the Modern Orient in Berlin. His main research interests include the role of religious movements in armed conflicts, the interaction of religion, politics and nationalism, political activism in Islam, and transnational Islamic movements. Thank you very much, Denis. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I won't start. In my presentation. I will examine the changing role of neo-Paganism within Russian armed and paramilitary groups during the Russian-Ukraine conflict since 2014, and also about the neo-Pagans' closest rivals, militarized orthodoxy, certain manifestations of which are sometimes difficult to distinguish from neo-paganism today. I argue that the presence of neo-pagans in Russian armed formation reached its peak during the period of active operation by the Wagner Group, when the use of mercenaries was encouraged and at an institutional level. The presence of neo-pagans within the Wagner Group became most evident in 2017, when one of the best-known militarized neo-pagan groups, the Rusic sabotage, assault, and reconnaissance unit joined the Wagner Group. The insignia of its fighters feature of Kolovrat, an 8-pointed swastika, which is one of the most popular symbols among Russian neo-pagans, neo-Nazism, and nationalists. In an interview, the commander of Rusic St. Petersburg resident Alexei Milchakov, callsign Serb, who had openly declared his Nazi views, stated that the unit consisted of nationalist Rodnover, a Russian form of neo-paganism. At the same time, the group's leadership saw themselves not merely as Slavic nationalists, but as a pan-Scandinavian group fighting for the reunification of Northern Europe. The group's neo-pagan character was also evident in the widespread use of runic symbols and a distinctive greeting gesture from the hair to the sun, reminiscence of the Nazi salute. Dmitry Utkin, callsign Wagner, commander of the Wagner Group, was also known for his sympathies towards Nazism and neo-paganism. According to the Wagnerites themselves, Utkin was a Rodnover and tried to appoint his like-minded Rodnover colleagues to command posts. For example, Wagner is total guy, not a softie. He came to the position near Palmyra, took his clothes off, and there on his arm, on his shoulder, was a German swastika, a tattoo. His helmet has horns on it. He's a Rodnover. To become a company commander, it's desirable to be a Rodnover. According to Murat Gibadulin, a former member of the Wagner Group, the group promoted Rodnoveria and anti-Semitism, made extensive use of runes in its symbolism, and favored the Kolovrat. Moreover, in 2019, an ideological department was formed within the Wagner Group to promote neo-paganism. It can be said that this period saw a resurgence of neo-paganism within the Wagner Group. In addition to private military companies, neo-paganism was also particularly popular among members of special forces units. It could be said that the neo-paganism practiced by the Wagner Group was part of a wider trend within the Russian special forces units. For example, according to Archpriest Vsevolod Chaplin, who oversaw the Russian Orthodox Church's relations with neo-pagan groups in 2016, during a conversation with him, a representative of one of Russia's security agencies complained that within that agency there were units where neo-pagans might make up as much as half the personnel, where such a spirit prevailed and where it was very difficult for a Christian colleague to get by. Moreover, according to Vsevolod Chaplin, this refers to elite units and special forces, which are associated with specialized military and physical training, as well as a closed way of life that implies an awareness of their own elitism and consequently the emergence of certain ideology. To a large extent, this trend has found its way into the security services, from martial arts clubs organized in part by former special forces personnel, were various forms of so-called rataborye, a Slavic martial art reconstructed or rather constructed by various enthusiasts of pan-Slavic unity, have become widespread. One of the most famous public examples of the fusion of professional combat sports with Slavic neo-Paganism Rodnoveria in Russia is the well-known Russian boxer, Olympic champion, and professional world heavyweight champion Alexander Povetkin, who competed under the name Russian Knight, Ruski Vites. His public departure from Orthodox Christianity to neo-Paganism, combined with his championship title, made him a cult figure, spreading neo-pagan views within the martial art community. The rapid rise in the popularity of neo-paganism, even within the military and martial arts clubs, has drawn a negative reaction from Patriarch Kirill, the head of the Russian Orthodox Church. This is all the more so given that the Russian Orthodox Church itself sought to become part of the armed forces and actively developed a network of Orthodox military patriotic clubs called Rataborets, where hand-to-hand combat is combined with the study of God's law. In effect, neo-Paganism Rodnoveria has entered into direct competition with the Russian Orthodox Church's militarized orthodoxy. Speaking in the summer of 2018 at a meeting of the Patriarchal Commission of Physical Culture and Sport, Patriarch Kirill stated, "The promotion of a healthy lifestyle and physical activity often leads to a resurgence of pagan attitudes towards the human body. When we first began to hear reports that pagan beliefs were gaining popularity among athletes, we initially regarded this as something of a curiosity and exception to the rule. But after gathering a large amount of information, we realized that ideas stemming from a pagan attitude toward humanity are becoming popular both in sporting circles and among military personnel, particularly those involved in life-threatening special operations." And Patriarch Kirill returned to the subject of the popularity of neo-paganism in 2022, following the start of the full-scale Russian invasion in Ukraine. "The world today is going through a very difficult period, first and foremost in terms of thought, in terms of our understanding of humanity, and even in terms of our philosophy of life. We know how the storm of pagan passions has truly taken hold of both our minds and our emotions, and this storm is sweeping people away, often even Orthodox Christians. Indeed, in addition to the rivalry between neo-pagans and the Russian Orthodox Church, which had drawn Kirill's displeasure, there were reports of excessive cruelty, torture, or dismemberment in the action of towards prisoners, as well as the use in propaganda videos of a sledgehammer symbolizing Mjolnir, Thor hammer for the execution, possibly staged, of traitors. Two videos featuring a sledgehammer are widely known. Is one, a Russian man named Evgeny Nuzhin is beaten with it. In the other, a Ukrainian man named Dmitry Yakushenko is beaten with it. The sledgehammer has effectively become the unofficial symbol of the Wagner Group. The press office of Prigozhin's company Concord reports that the businessman's lawyer had sent a violin case containing a sledgehammer to the European Parliament, the handle of which was smeared with fake blood. This was Prigozhin's response to the intention to designate the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization. Prigozhin also used a sledgehammer bearing the Wagner Group's insignia as a gift to one of Ramzan Kadyrov's closest associates, Abti Alaudinov. Interestingly, in one of his interviews, when asked about killing traitors with a sledgehammer, Prigozhin stated that the sledgehammer is a symbol of Thor, the Norse god of thunder. I know there is a sledgehammer, a fine tool, a symbol, Thor's hammer. It is difficult to say whether Prigozhin himself was a supporter of neo-Paganism, but such comments suggest that he had at least heard such interpretation among his circle. However, following an attempted mutiny led by Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of the Wagner Group, this private military company was disbanded and its fighters transferred to other military units, primarily to the African Corps of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the private military company Redut. In effect, following the death of Prigozhin and Utkin and the de facto collapse of the Wagner Group, neo-Paganism lost in institutional support. At the same time, the Russian Orthodox Church began actively expanding its presence within the army. In particular, the Synodal Department for Relations with the Armed Forces and Law Enforcement Agencies, the Russian Orthodox Church, main body responsible for liaising with the armed forces, stepped up its activities. Also, it had exercised since 1995. It only gained real influence in 2023 after it was headed by Metropolitan Kirill Pokrovsky of Stavropol and Nevinnomysk, known for his ultra-patriotic stance and support for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. In his view, it is Russia that has taken on the role of fighting against the demonic liberal world order. Under Metropolitan Kirill, the Synodal Department took on its final form and currently comprises 10 sectors responsible for liaising with the various branches and services of the armed forces. Almost simultaneously with Metropolitan Kirill, his deputy, Archpriest Dmitry Vasilenkov, a former officer, was appointed. He also took up the post of the chief military chaplains of the clergy ministering to servicemen of the Russian armed forces and personnel of other security agency in the combat zone. According to Metropolitan Kirill Pokrovsky, in 2024, there were 309 military chaplains serving with the Russian Orthodox Church in the conflict zone in Ukraine. According to the data he provided, a total of around 1,000 priests, both full-time and volunteers, visited the conflict zone, while the shortage of full-time clergy is estimated at around 1,300. The Russian Orthodox Church continues to integrate ever more deeply into the Russian armed forces. In 2024, the Russian Orthodox Church Theological Educational Institution were instructed to include a new subject in the curriculum for the 2024-25 academic year, Fundamentals of Training Clergy for Service in a Combat Zone. Following a decision of the Higher Church Council of the Russian Orthodox Church, headed by Patriarch Kirill, on 16 April 2024, the new course will be based on the book of the Russian Orthodox Church's chief military chaplains, Archpriest Dmitry Vasilenkov, From Death to Life at War, Password Donbass. Overall, the state current stands toward neo-Paganism is largely negative, as the Russian Orthodox Church is increasingly establishing itself as an ideological partner through the concept of the Russian world and sacralization of war. Moreover, Vladimir Putin himself has spoken out in support of the so-called traditional faith, which in Russia are generally understood to mean, first and foremost, Orthodox Christianity, and to a lesser extent Islam, Buddhism, and Judaism. Stating is one of his speeches. The support of clergy is always in demand, both in time of peace and time of great hardship. Always. I would like to point out that clergy from virtually all our traditional faiths are, in the truest sense of the word, on the front line. At the same time, among members of ultranationalistic circles who have links with neo-pagans, there are instances of support for the Ukrainian side in the ongoing armed conflict. For example, Denis Kapustin and the Russian Volunteer Corps, or Alexei Levkin, which fuels mistrust on the part of official Russian authorities. And finally, when considering potential lessons for Europe and Great Britain, it is worth noting that the experience of the Russian-Ukrainian armed conflict points to a rise in certain practices that can be identified as neo-pagan in the context of protracted armed conflict. This occurs most frequently in volunteer units and special forces against the backdoor of the development of a military cult in general and the formation of a military brotherhood. Presumably, the strengthening of neo-pagan tendencies can be countered by the presence of an alternative ideological system implemented, for example, through the institution of military chaplains. Thank you so much. I finish.
Thank you so much, Denis. That was really very interesting, and it's given me lots to think about there. We have some time for questions, about just over 10 minutes. We've got some in the chat that I think maybe we can start with. But if you'd like to raise your hand, I will take them that way as well. Please just introduce yourself and your affiliation, and perhaps who, if one person in particular, you'd like to direct your question to. Maybe to get us started in the chat, there was a question from Ethan Doyle White. Maybe I think that's actually been responded to in the chat, actually. Let me just have a look about the Day of the Dead. Okay, yeah. We have a question here from Olga Yomina, and she wonders to what extent some of the similar Orthodox Church versus pagan tensions also exist on the Ukrainian side, perhaps among the Azov, and she's referring to the new context warfare shown by a slide shown by Ross. Would anyone like to respond? Do we see those similar rivalries that Denis has been referring to? Adrian, please.
Well, thank you very much for this question. Regarding the attitude of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church toward the Ukrainian pagans, actually, the context right now, we can see that there is a kind of national solidarity. However, hard the different aspects of faith. Actually, you can see some tensions. The first one, I think, is about the narrative have the Ukrainian Orthodox Church promotes the idea that yes, Ukraine, contrary to Russia, is the true heir aware of the Kievan Rus. So this is the first discourse placed in the first place, which is balancing actually what are saying the pagans, saying that before being Christianized, the Rus people, the Kievan Rus, was mostly pagans. The second thing we can see within you're referring to tensions within Azov. Well, we have to say that actually in Azov, which is now bigger than the previous units, which we saw in the 2014 to from 2014 to 2022, well, the paganism is quite a minority faith, the most majority, and even inside with the head figures of Azov, I'm thinking about Andriy Biletsky, or even his right arm Nazar Kravchenko, Mykola Kravchenko, sorry, were Orthodox. But we can see actually some tensions between us different nationalist units. I'm thinking, for example, about the Bratstvo units led by one historical figure of Ukrainian radical nationalism, Mitro Horshinsky, who since the beginning actually criticized the so-called pagan inflection of some units like Azov, saying that it's not it's a kind of a trend, hipster one. It has nothing to do with the true cultural heritage of Ukraine. So that's what we can observe for now.
Thanks, Adrian. Do any of the other presenters want to respond to that question? Okay, then let's go to Berend, who's got a hand up there. Do you want to come off, turn on the mic, Berend, and ask your question?
Okay, thank you very much. I don't know which speaker this is, but I was wondering, I've spent some years in Africa, and there you saw, for instance, in many places, a mix or a hybrid between Christianity and animistic faith. Do you also see here this kind of hybrid between Christianity and these pagan beliefs? And if one of you could also address, to what extent is this like a natural phenomenon that like people rediscovering roots or things like that? And to what extent has it maybe been pushed or nurtured from different elements, like within the army or government, to utilize it for the war effort? And I don't know who could answer that best.
Who would like to have a go at that one? Or shall we take a couple? I can see Howard Williams having the hand up there as well. If we take that question from Howard, and then we'll come to both of them. Come off the mic.
Hello. Yes, thank you very much. Really fascinating presentations. And I put a comment in the chat, and I just want to follow that up. I'm aware of some of my archaeological colleagues from the US and elsewhere working on, deliberate destruction of heritage sites as part of the conflict. And I wondered whether there's any discursive interaction between, plundering, looting for profits, the opportunity of conflict of heritage sites, and this sort of motive to find land claim and find symbols, because a lot of the discussion shows a whole raft of Viking era abstract symbols used on, militaria and flags and so on. But, are people actually looting to acquire these objects? I'm interested in those intersections of sort of looting sites and symbolism. Thank you.
Which one of was that addressed to any of the presenters in particular, or would any of them like to?
No, it was more of a general thing. Thank you very much.
I think Kaarina would like to respond.
Yes, thank you. Fascinating questions. And I start from this Christianity and paganism, and it's obvious that there is quite a lot of mixing and borrowing, and also discussions about, as I mentioned, this Maslenitsa and Shroetide. It's a festival that there are Christian elements, pagan elements, some differences, like, for example, which date and so on. But on individual level, I think that people often quite often mix these. Another question is, do they kind of admit or identify as being having this kind of syncretic or hybrid religious identity, or to use the Russian word "vayeveria," which is coming from already at least 19th century, the tradition of mixing pagan and Christian religious elements. But I think it's more rare for the people to actually identify as Orthodox Christian and pagan. Another thing is that at current political situation, many pagans emphasize that they don't want to anyway insult Orthodox Christians, and they respect its role in Russian history and so on. About these archaeological symbols and looting, unfortunately I don't know anything, but if my colleagues would have any information, I would be very grateful.
Adrian.
Regarding this question for looting, of course, some Ukrainian association and even the United Nations reporting that yes, the Russian occupation forces proceed to different looting, especially in the occupied territory of Ukraine, targeting especially some key pieces from museum linked to the Scythian era. Well, for sure, when you hear the Russian authorities, the main historical narrative justifying the annexation of this territory is linked to the medieval era and of course the Kievan Rus. But if we can also observe in some radical movement more deeper question regarding the origin of Slavic people, and by the origin I'm talking about Indo-European one. You have actually this battle for what they call the Urheimat, which is the term for the origin of Indo-European languages and people. So I'm not going to explain a lot, but you actually for all Ukrainian pagans, it's like they are defending the cradle of Europe and Indo-European people, and for Russians, and here we can draw a parallel with some theories. The main one were designed by Alexander Dugin before being a Eurasianist, and Eurasianist. He was a Nazi occultist, and he made several speeches and pieces about Hyperborea, which identified Hyperborea in Russia, and for him, like annexing the Urheimat again to Russia was a way to prevent the collapse of the world, the rise of what he called the satanic order. So he make a mixture with Christianity, Cateron, etc. But yeah, actually there is in the far right movement fighting in Ukraine in the two camps. You have this question of origins and explain also the looting.
Thanks, Adrian. We have got some questions in the chat here. Eleanor McDonald-Dick asks, many of the groups mentioned incorporate Nordic or Germanic pagan symbols and myth. Is there pushback again among Slavic pagans against using these Germanic symbols, or conversely, some justification for including them? I will go through the other ones as well while we think about that. There's also the question from Yulia Kiselyova. What is the relationship between neo-pagans and the Russian government and Putin? Are there tensions? And has there been any evolution in that relationship? Freya asks, is there any information on how women contribute to neo-Nazism within the Slavic pagan context? We've got a lot of focus on men, but interesting to have your insights on that. And then we've got Ian in Jefford Franks at the end, intrigued with the question of how widespread neo-pagan or Norse paganism is, and is there information about that? Obviously, it's a tricky question to measure, but who would like to have at these questions? They're in the final moments.
I could briefly respond to Ian in Jefford Franks. we briefly pick up on this in the book. Well, several occasions in the book we talk about that. I think definitely there is a sense of commonality because a lot of Slavic pagans are seeing, they're on social media, they're online, and they pick up on the same kinds of currents that everyone else in the rest of the world picks up on. So, as an example, to take this out of both the Western and the Eastern European context, we see this similar kinds of issues and ideas coming up even in Latin America, where Slavic paganism does exist there to some degree, but certainly heathenry and asatru is pretty huge in Latin America. And obviously there's a language barrier there with English, but they seem to be online be picking up these similar trends and aspects as Eastern Europeans do. So I'd recommend the book, and we've got a whole range of contributors there with lots of different perspectives that could at least give you more threads to investigate and follow up on that. Thanks for the question.
And a final word from Kaarina.
Okay, thank you. I try to be super quick because we don't have much time. So yes, there is definitely an increase of mix of Norse paganism and Slavic paganism. Many people argue that actually the Vikings have a role in Russian history and it's the same tradition and so on, but it has been attracted some criticism from some other Ranavievs. About Putin, many support him, many actually oppose him. I mean, this checking of paganism and the conservative turn has disillusioned many, but they may say that we are not fighting for the Kremlin and we may be suppressed, but anyway, we are fighting for our country and our people and so on. So there are different kind of forms of nationalism. Quickly about women, it's indeed something that should be studied more, and there are myriad of different kind of roles. On the one hand, many pagans have a very conservative worldview, and it's the major role for women is being mother and so on. But they are also volunteers in the front, even in the fighting, as at least I have heard. So, thank you.
Thanks, Kaarina. And indeed, yeah, I think that we are indeed out of time at this moment. But thank you very much for your fascinating questions. I've put a reading list into the chat. If you scroll back, you can find some further works to learn a little bit more about this. Also, I can email it to you if you just reach out. Yeah, thanks very much. Please do get in touch if you'd like to continue the conversation about this. We'd be glad to hear from you. And thank you very much to all our presenters today for your perspectives. It's been really interesting. And yeah, let's continue the conversation. All the best and have a great weekend when it comes around. Thank you for coming.